Katie waited anxiously for the call from the voodoo practitioner. When it finally came, she was told the spell was complete. All she had to do was meet Dan in person, and he would fall irrevocably in love with her. Fueled by confidence and determination, Katie dressed provocatively and made her way to linger near Dan's apartment, ensuring Amina wouldn't see her. The first day, her plan didn't work. Dan had gone with his work friends for one of his friends' birthday celebrations and returned very late. Frustrated but not discouraged, Katie woke early the next morning, leaving Paul and Clara still asleep. She arrived just in time to see Dan leaving his apartment. This was her chance, she thought. Katie rushed into the garage and called his name. Dan turned, and the moment he saw her, it was as if something had changed. His eyes lit up with an immediate attraction and obsession, and he stared at her as if she were the only beautiful woman he had ever seen. Katie spoke, but Dan didn't even hear her words. He was utterly captivated, with flash of desires. Without hesitation, Dan invited Katie into his car. Instead of heading to work, he drove her to a nearby upscale hotel, where they spent hours together, culminating in an affair. This marked the beginning of their secret relationship. Dan began neglecting Amina, skipping their usual weekends together to spend time with Katie. He rented her a hotel room and visited her often, even staying overnight. Katie, thrilled by her success, became increasingly bold. Meanwhile, at home, Paul noticed her absence and excuses about work-related probation periods. Clara was often left at her grandparents' house as Paul worked long hours, and Katie was nowhere to be found. Amina noticed the changes in Dan. Though they worked together, he was increasingly unavailable. Their once cherished weekends were rare, and even when he was present, he seemed distant. Amina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to justify it, attributing his absence to work, but Amina instincts told her it was more than just a busy schedule. Katie, now empowered by her control over Dan, began treating Amina with increasing disrespect. She acted superior and dismissive, secure in the knowledge that Dan was hers. She acted as though she had the upper hand, secure in her position and unbothered by Amina's discomfort. One day, after a heated argument with Paul about her late nights and neglect of Clara, Katie packed her things to leave with Clara. Her decision to leave Paul was the culmination of months of frustration and growing resentment ever since she's met Dan, Amina's fiancé. The argument that day had been the tipping point. Despite Paul's pleas, she coldly dismissed him, declaring she didn't love him and never had. Paul, taken aback, and pleaded with her, desperate for any chance to make things right. But Katie's resolve was unshakable. Her cold dismissal stung, but it was clear that her heart had already left the relationship long before the words were spoken. One Friday, Amina's suspicions got the better of her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could bear the emotional toll. Something had to change, she thought. Dan wasn't answering her calls, and she knew Fridays were typically his least busy day. Deciding to confront him face to face, she went to his apartment. When she unlocked and opened the door with her own set of keys, the sight of a woman's bag and shoes in the entryway stopped her in her tracks. Confused and heartbroken, she called out Dan's name, but there was no response. Desperation pushed her to search the apartment. When she reached the private swimming pool area, the sight that greeted her shattered her. Dan and Katie were in the pool, kissing passionately. Amina screamed, demanding Katie to leave, but Katie smirked and refused. Dan finally spoke, confessing he loved Katie and wanted to be with her. Amina, overwhelmed, collapsed to the floor. Her world crumbled as the love of her life declared his betrayal. An ambulance was called, and she was rushed to the hospital. There, doctors informed her devastating news. She had been 5 weeks pregnant, a fact she hadn't known, and had lost the baby. Worse still, complications required the removal of her uterus, and she will never be able to conceive in the future. Amina spent 3 weeks in the hospital before being discharged to continue recovering at home. Her family by her side, her parents and sisters supported her, throughout devastated by the toll this betrayal had taken. Amina, physically and emotionally shattered, struggled to find a way forward. 2 months later, Dan and Katie held an extravagant wedding that became the talk of the town. The opulence and grandeur of the event were unmatched, with high-profile guests, luxurious decorations. Amina, still recovering from her emotional and physical trauma, eventually found out about the wedding. The news hit her hard. She was devastated, which caused her to relapse. Sending her back to hospital again, the hospital room was filled with a heavy silence. Amina lay on the bed, pale and fragile, surrounded by her family. Her parents sat quietly, their faces marked with concern, while her sister held her hand tightly, offering silent support. Amina stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment of betrayal over and over in her mind. She felt a deep emptiness, a combination of the loss of her child, and that she will never be able to bear a child and the man she had loved with all her heart. However, with the unwavering support of her family, Amina slowly began to heal. She found strength in their love and encouragement. After dismissed from the hospital, her family was still around her. Weeks later, she began attending therapy, which helped her process her pain and rediscover her sense of self. Through counseling, she found the courage to forgive, not for Dan or Katie's sake, but for her own peace of mind. And over time, she was able to recover once again. Though the pain remained, Amina knew that moving forward, no matter how difficult, was the only way to reclaim her peace and leave the hurt behind. She vowed to focus on building a future filled with purpose and joy. Amina decided it was time for a change. She requested a transfer to a different district within the same company, allowing her to start fresh in a new city, away from the constant reminders of Dan and Katie's life together. Her company approved the request. Amina relocated to her new city, bringing with her a renewed sense of purpose. The change of scenery, combined with the support of therapy and her family, helped her rebuild her life. By the end of her 6 months leave from work, Amina was ready to return to work. Her colleagues at the new office welcomed her warmly, and she immersed herself in her career, determined to focus on her own happiness and success. She also began to explore hobbies and activities that brought her joy. Slowly but surely, she rebuilt her confidence and found peace within herself. Though the scars of her past remained, Amina no longer allowed them to define her. She was determined to create a life filled with purpose and fulfillment. Meanwhile, Katie's life with Dan continued to flourish and enjoying the fruits of her manipulative climb. She soon became pregnant with Dan's child. The pregnancy brought them closer, as Dan spared no expense in ensuring Katie and Clara were well cared for. Months later, Katie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Not long after their son's birth, Katie became pregnant again. This time she gave birth to a baby girl, completing their family. With 3 children, Clara from Katie's previous relationship and 2 with Dan, Katie's life seemed perfect. Dan was a devoted husband under the spell and father, providing everything Katie and the children needed. They also moved to a bugger accommodation nearby. The luxurious home was filled with laughter and the energy of young children, and Katie felt she had finally achieved the life she had always dreamed of, indulged in her newfound status, enjoying the luxurious lifestyle Dan provided. She was confident that she had won. 5 years later, cracks began to form in her seemingly perfect life. Unbeknownst to Katie, the voodoo practitioner's spell was not permanent. As time went on, Dan's initial crush on Katie, sparked by the spell, turned into an obsession that lacked care. Their once strong bond started to feel strained. Dan began to have moments of clarity that confused him. He experienced vivid memories from his past that left him feeling uneasy and unable to understand them. He started to sense something was wrong in his relationship with Katie, but couldn't figure out what it was. Meanwhile, Katie became frustrated with Dan's constant need for her attention. His unpredictable actions, which she once found charming, now felt overwhelming. She grew impatient with his demands, and their relationship dynamic changed. The attention she used to enjoy became a source of stress, and she struggled to keep control, as Dan's growing doubts and behavior eroded her sense of security. Katie noticed the change in Dan's behaviors all over the place and getting worse. He began asking questions about certain things from the past. It felt like his memory was coming back on track and the spell wearing off. Panicking, she thought to return quickly to the voodoo practitioner, demanding answers. The practitioner explained and warned her that love spells were unpredictable and could wear off over time, especially if the bond wasn't genuine. Katie was furious, realizing her grip on Dan might be slipping, demanded to strengthen and prolong the spell. Meanwhile, Dan was leaving in 2 days for a week, work-related trip to a different city, and Katie was frantic to strengthen the spell before he left for his trip. Dan's work trip had been ordinary until the 4th day. As he stepped out of a meeting, his eyes were drawn to a silhouette across the hallway, visible through a large glass window. Something about the figure struck him as eerily familiar. His heart pounded as he instinctively approached. His curiosity piqued. He reached the office and knocked gently on the glass window. The woman turned around, and to their mutual surprise, their eyes locked. "Amina?" Dan's voice trembled. Disbelief etched across his face.